Recent Pew data shows that a majority of Americans consider fake news to be a problem even greater than things like racism, climate change, and even violent crime.
Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. And that is not fake news when I say that. But what is fake news is a lot of what people are seeing online over the last few years. And researchers such as Sam Rhodes are looking into the prevalence of it and how people respond to it. Sam Rhodes is a PhD from Washington State University and currently teaching and researching at Utah Valley University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sam, let's jump right into it with the seemingly the obvious question, but we hear a lot about this term from pundits, from politicians, from punchlines in comedy. What exactly is it from your standpoint, fake news?
Well, you're right. There are a lot of competing definitions for what this term is, but most scholars would agree that fake news is information that is demonstrably false. It's just not real. But it has the trappings and sort of the sense that it could be real news. For example, many real fake news websites that are out there employ a stock ticker or a weather ticker with a logo, and if you were to click on it and you weren't, any wiser, you might suspect that it is in fact a real piece of journalism, but it is in fact all fabricated and is usually created to advance some sort of political goal.
So you've done a lot of research on this topic when you were at Washington State University and continuing now. Give us some of the top line findings of what you found in your research.
Yes. Well, scholars have suggested for some time that echo chambers, being a member of a group, for example, on Facebook or Twitter, where you are usually connected with people that share the same sorts of political ideology that you do and the same sorts of views, that if you're a member of one of these echo chambers, that you are perhaps more susceptible to believing fake news than you otherwise would be. And my research shows that that is in fact the case, that when you're surrounded by people who think the way that you do and act the way that you do, that you are perhaps less critical than you would otherwise be of fake information.
So we think that there could be a generational imbalance in play, or it might seem that way. And I'm just curious, from your research, does it show that maybe younger generations who grew up on the internet, are they less susceptible to being victims of fake news than their older counterparts?
You're correct, and my research isn't the only one that shows that. There are others out there that have found that older Americans are more susceptible to believing and sharing fake material than younger Americans. Perhaps, you're correct. That might be an effect of younger people just being more aware of what fishy stuff looks like on the internet, and they're more keen on that, while perhaps older Americans who didn't grow up on the internet, that maybe didn't have a media literacy course in high school or something or in college, are just more likely to believe this stuff.
Obviously, the 600-pound gorilla, or whatever pound gorilla it is in the room, is Facebook. And it takes a lot of heat from politicians, from people in the media, from perhaps researchers such as yourself. But let's be honest, Facebook isn't the only tech company out there that is big and has a lot of influence in daily life. Is Facebook really the main, I hate to say culprit because it's not like they're causing it, but the disseminator of this sort of thing, or are there others? And if Facebook, say, went away tomorrow and there was nothing left except for all the other tech companies, would this issue still persist in the same way that we've seen it before?
I imagine if Facebook went away that we would find these problems on other platforms if something became more popular down the road. But you are correct. Facebook is by and large the largest portal for fake information. People share this stuff in Facebook groups, in Facebook Messenger, just on their regular news feeds. And then from there, it is linked to fake news websites. But this isn't necessarily being caused by Facebook, as you say. They're just very popular. We found that in 2016, it was the first time that more Americans got their news from places like Facebook, social media sites, than they did from traditional avenues. And that is a trend that shows no signs of reversing.
So there's been a lot of perhaps reaction, not yet regulation from a legalistic standpoint, but at least reaction in the popular news media, hearings being done on Capitol Hill, pulling in Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, and kind of holding him to task and his feet to the fire. And it sounds like they've said that they're going to make changes, and they're going to, rejigger things a little bit so they aren't as it isn't as easy to deceive people and share this misinformation. I just wonder, from your standpoint, is that really an honest effort on their part?
Well, you're right to be somewhat suspicious because immediately following the 2016 election and some evidence that there was a large, substantial amount of fake news. There's some research showing that more fake news articles were shared on Facebook in the last few weeks of the election than real news articles. Facebook was originally dismissive of this and said that it wasn't a problem and that hardly anybody read this, and we now know that not to be true. Facebook seems to be taking corrective action. They are actively involved in research, for example, looking at how to better strengthen their fact checking. If someone shares a fake story, that maybe they're able to do some sort of real-time fact checking. They're involved in research. I recently saw some Facebook researchers presenting at a political science conference in Washington, D.C. They're doing more than they used to. Whether or not that's enough to make a substantial difference, we'll probably know in the 2020 election.
You've also looked at the idea of what are called deep fakes. We've heard more about those in recent months and in the last year or so. Basically, how technology has evolved to allow such simple ways of creating and also disseminating things that are frankly false but look very real. Videos of people, audio recreations, things like that. There was a prominent example somewhat recently with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and other things. As we go into the 2020 election, what are researchers such as yourself looking at in terms of how to combat the idea of deep fakes?
Yes. So deepfakes are tricky, and part of the problem is that they're so new. Some of these technologies are thankfully still out of reach for most people. It does require a level of technical sophistication and knowledge that most people don't have yet. For example, part of the reason why fake news articles are such a problem is because it's become relatively easy the last few years to just open up a WordPress website and register a .com. It takes very little technical knowledge. Deepfakes are still somewhat out of reach, but it is concerning. There are researchers looking into this. But thankfully, this is still somewhat of a small issue and it hasn't gone mainstream quite yet. But scholars are looking at this quite closely. Some of these deepfake videos are quite convincing. But for example, the Nancy Pelosi video that you referenced didn't take much technical sophistication. Whoever made that, all they really did was slow down the audio to make it appear that she had some sort of speech impediment or had some sort of mental deficiency. That isn't that difficult to do. It's just simply cranking down the speed on a video. But to create a video that is synced with audio of, for example, Barack Obama saying things that are just knowingly false, just made up things, that is a little more difficult. And that, I imagine, will be easier for people to spot and be suspicious of because it's so difficult to make convincing videos. However, in time, I imagine the technology will become more sophisticated and easier for the average user to use. So in time, we'll see just how problematic these deepfakes are. But right now, I'd say that the verdict is still out, and we're not exactly sure how this will impact things like the 2020 election.
I'm curious about when you mentioned the technology angle. Is the technology to detect these sorts of things, deep fakes, behind the technology to create them, meaning that the malevolent actors will always be ahead of the benevolent ones, or at least the ones who are trying to root it out? Is there some power imbalance there?
I think with any new technology, any new phenomena, such as just even generic fake news articles, that the malicious actors will always be one step ahead of the rest of us. That's unfortunately how this is going to play out in my imagination. And I believe that the best solutions for this are things like media literacy, good civics education. For example, if you were to see Barack Obama saying something that you know is just downright silly or really out of character for him, if you already possess that knowledge, then you're probably going to be more suspicious than, say, someone who really doesn't know what his views are or doesn't really follow politics. So, while the technology might be sophisticated and new and novel, I believe the solutions, and I think many other researchers would agree with this, the solutions are somewhat old-fashioned. Good education, good civics knowledge, good media literacy, taking a journalism class, taking a civics course. These are the best defenses that society has against these sorts of tools.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the idea of media literacy because I wanted to kind of close out on that point. What are states such as Washington and maybe Idaho, Oregon, from your knowledge, doing to boost the idea of media literacy and education in those fields, not necessarily just STEM, in recent years? Or is it in response to this in recent years?
I would argue that the media literacy actions taken by states like Washington have been likely in direct response to the sorts of problems that we're seeing with fake news in the 2016 election. And I'm happy to see that. Washington is actually a trailblazer in this regard. They have done really above and beyond the call of good media literacy, putting resources, for example, online for teachers in any school district to use, not just in the state, but outside the state. I recently learned that here in Utah, media literacy is a required subject now in public high schools. That's good, and this is evident that both red and blue states are paying attention to this problem. Recent Pew data shows that a majority of Americans consider fake news to be a problem even greater than things like racism, climate change, and even violent crimes. And I believe that it can only grow more powerful if it's coupled with not just media literacy, but also American civics classes. How does Congress work? How does a bill get passed? With this sorts of information, Americans can really increase their defenses against being manipulated by both domestic and foreign actors with fake news.
Sam Rhodes, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating talking with you and hearing about your research.
Thank you so much, Scott. It was a pleasure.
Sam Rhodes is a PhD political scientist and researcher who studies fake news at Utah Valley University. For more information on this topic and for general news items, come to our website, nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.